hard-fought litigation had at last come to a successful end. The deportation that John Demjanek's lawyer had assured me we would never accomplish had just been accomplished. It was a very satisfying victory in the pursuit of justice on behalf of Demjanek's victims. And my deputy and I were almost incredulous as we watched that plane take off. Pursuant to federal law, the Social Security Administration terminated Demjanek's Social Security benefits. Upon arrival in Germany the following morning, Demjanek resumed feigning grave illness, as you see here, and numerous German newspaper photos showed him prone and again looking like death warmed over. Demjanek's Munich trial opened on November 30, 2009 and continued into the following year and into early 2011. He insisted on being in a wheelchair because he said he couldn't walk. Sometimes they brought him in on a stretcher, and he was permitted to lie down in court during the trial, sleeping through much of it, even when the survivors were testifying about the conditions to which they were subjected at Sobibor. Two brave Sobibor survivors, Thomas Blatt and Philip Bialowitz, both of the United States, and he disrespected them grotesquely. And the media fell for all this. He was routinely described in media accounts here and in Germany and elsewhere as being gravely ill and confined to a stretcher or wheelchair. At the trial, the Munich prosecutor mostly re-presented the evidence that had been assembled and offered in court by OSI's attorneys in the United States and by our staff historian. Demjanek didn't testify, but he issued a statement continuing to deny that he had ever served in any Nazi camps. To our surprise, his lawyers revived the KGB defense, arguing that all of the documents were Soviet forgeries, despite the absence of forensic evidence supporting such a contention, despite the fact that a forensic expert engaged by Demjanek, as I said, had found no evidence of forgery, despite the fact that some of the captured Nazi documentation had been found in West German archives, and despite the fact that other documentation naming Demjanek had been found in Ukraine and Lithuania well after the collapse of Soviet communism, and it of course made no sense to posit that the KGB would have gone to all this effort to forge Nazi documents, and rather than make them available to prosecutors in the West, they would decide to bury those documents in then Soviet-controlled Ukraine and Lithuania, bury them in the archives there, so that they might, or might not, be found one day, some indeterminate number of years later in the future, in the unlikely event that the Soviet Union ever collapsed and Demjanek was still alive. It was a preposterous notion, as the German court would soon agree. On May 12th, and by the way, here's another picture of Demjanek at trial. Yeah, obviously not more than a few hours to live. Here he is being brought to court on a stretcher. On May 12, 2011, the Munich court at last issued its verdict, convicting Demjanek of serving as an accessory in the murders of some 28,000 Jews at the Sobibor extermination camp. What a fabulous accomplishment this was, the triumph of US-German cooperation. In light of his advanced age in particular, the court sentenced Demjanek to 5 years in prison, which actuarially speaking was likely a life sentence. But the court released him pending appeal. That couldn't happen in this country. He couldn't be convicted of complicity in even one murder and be released pending appeal, but he was released pending appeal, and he went to live in a retirement home in Germany. Soon after his release, the supposedly invalid John Demjanek, confined to a stretcher, was surreptitiously photographed walking in the street outside his retirement home without any difficulty and without any crane or other external support. And here's that picture. Nice blue jeans, nice blue jean jacket. Looking good, nice baseball cap. A faker. Last year, to wrap it up, Demjanek's US lawyers brought suit in federal court in Cleveland, charging us, the Justice Department, with having committed fraud in procuring Demjanek's second denaturalization back in 2002. We proved that those claims were false, and the district court rejected them. And just a few weeks ago, the Court of Appeals affirmed that decision. Demjanek died on March 17 of this year in Germany as a convicted Nazi criminal, a proven habitual liar, and, at the end, a man without a country. It took well over 3 decades to vindicate the rule of law in the John Demjanek case, but the rule of law at last prevailed. As Dr. Martin Luther King famously once said, "The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice." I think we proved that in the John Demjanek case. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eli. Before we start the questions, I want to call your attention to Tom Loftus, who is Bob Jackson's grandson.
It must have cost millions of dollars to defend this despicable man. Where did all that money come from? What was it, pro bono?
He had some pro bono assistance. He also was the beneficiary of a large defense fund that was created for him based in the Ukrainian communities of the United States and Canada. And in this last go-around, when he was suing us, he was permitted to avail himself of the services of the Office of the Federal Public Defender in Cleveland, Ohio. The budget for which comes from all of us. It's a federal taxpayer-funded office, and they do great work. But they, strangely enough, launched a worldwide investigation engaging a private investigative firm at who knows what cost to reinvestigate a case that wasn't actually before the court. So that's where the money came, and I'm sure some of it was Demjanek's own money.
Well, that last office has limited funds.
The
Seems like the last office you mentioned had limited funds. It seems like a waste of taxpayer money.
You know, I can't disagree with you. I mean, there are people charged with crimes who desperately need representation.
Good question.
Is there more to the story about Brent Tower basically having falling out with Demjanek, not paying back the money that he owed him? Is there a story behind the story in that one?
There's so many stories involving Jerome Brentar, I hardly know where to start. They did, yes, have this falling out. Brentar, who had once told the Cleveland Plain dealer that I believed so strongly in Demjanek that I would put my hand in the fire for him. Jerome Brentar, who at first we didn't realize was a Holocaust denier. Jerome Brentar, who at one point acknowledged that he had helped bring thousands of former Waffen SS men to the United States when he was working on U.S. immigration, in a U.S. immigration office, the International Refugee Organization, I think, in Europe after the war, so not a U.S. office. But Jerome Brentar, who eventually came out openly as a Holocaust denier, Jerome Brentar, who got a position, volunteer position on the ethnic outreach campaign of the first President George Bush, who, to the campaign's great credit, was jettisoned once the media reported who was on their campaign. They booted him. Jerome Brentar, who debated a member of Congress, I think it was Stephen Solars, on CNN as to the reality of the Holocaust. And if you'll forgive me, I must tell my personal Jerome Brentar story. In the early 1980s, before we knew what Jerome Brentar was, he showed up as a defense witness in the case of a Chicago resident concentration camp guard named Viudis Kairis from Lithuania. And he was to testify that it wouldn't have mattered if Kairis had revealed to U.S. immigration authorities that he'd served in the SS. Brentar was, we were told, was going to say, and I know that because I brought him all, I let all these SS men come to the United States. So I was the first one in the room at the law firm in Chicago, huge law firm, Kirkland & Ellis, that was representing Kairis at the request of the federal court pro bono. Beautiful conference room. I'm waiting for Brentar. My boss is going to come soon to take the deposition. Kairis' lawyer is going to defend the deposition. Brentar walks in. Looks like a perfectly nice fellow. Shake hands. I introduce myself, of course. He says, Rosenbaum. What kind of name is that? And truthfully, I said, it's a German name. Ah, he was very pleased. He smiled broadly. That's wonderful. And he said, Neil Schur, Mr. Schur, your boss is due here. What kind of name is that? Truthfully, I said, it's a Lithuanian name. He didn't go beyond that. Of course, both of us were Jewish. And then we started taking his deposition. And he was lying from the start about little things that didn't need to lie about. And finally, Neil said, Mr. Brentar, you were asked to bring with you any documents you had pertaining to World War II. Did you bring any? And he said, yes, I did. And he took out a stack of paper and put it on the table. Neil indicated to me that I would now leaf through this stuff while Neil, continued to ask questions. And so I did. And early on, as I went through these papers, I found a little pamphlet entitled 6 Million Lost and Found. Didn't take much imagination to know what that was. Sure enough, I opened it, and it was a Holocaust denial monstrosity. So I whispered to Neil, do you know what this is? He said, no. I said, we better take a break. Went into the other room. We looked through it. Neil had a field day questioning Brentar about this. Brentar said, well, I'm not saying I necessarily agree, but he said I should bring anything I had about the Second World War. Again, later on, he came out openly.
Why, by the way, did Demjanek put Sobibor on his visa application?
Great question. Why did Demjanek? Sure. Why did Demjanek put, of all things, Sobibor, Poland, on his visa application? Well, we've heard Demjanek's mutually contradictory stories. No one can be sure why it happened. I think I know why he did it. It turned out to be a very smart move. I think Demjanek feared that somehow there was some piece of paper that the United States would encounter as it was processing his visa application that would say Sobibor, Poland, and have his name on it. After all, American forces had captured a lot of Nazi documentation themselves. I think he gambled that if that were so, that the Americans wouldn't know what it meant, what Sobibor was. After all, by then, in the early 50s, I think I said this, Poland was firmly within Soviet orbit. We probably, in his view, wouldn't have access to any of that information. I think he probably knew that Sobibor had been destroyed after the extraordinary prisoner uprising in 1943. There was nothing left of it, as though it had never existed. So he gambled that U.S. immigration authorities wouldn't know what the word meant, and of course, he gambled well. They had no idea. No idea. So it worked. One other thing. He was smart enough to say that he was already in Sobibor before the war in the 1930s and left it only in 1943. Now, why would you do something like that? Because everyone knew that if you were speaking of an immigrant, an immigration applicant, who had been of fighting age, combat, military service age during the Second World War, what you were supposed to look for was, okay, where did they go when they left home? To see if they had joined an SS unit or something like that. So Demjanek made it appear as though he'd been living in Sobibor all along and left only in 1943. Very, very clever.
Question?
Why were there no death camps in Germany?
Why were there no death camps in Germany?
And I know people died in all
Of course, in camps all over Germany. I'm not sure, and there are historians who can address that. I think the answer is that, first of all, the Nazis wanted the Jews and Gypsies and others out of Germany, and so the first order of business was to move them out. And as they acquired territory in the east, that was a place to move them. I suspect they also were nervous about the possibility of their own citizens actually seeing the extermination process, smelling burning flesh, things like that. Didn't want to subject them to that.
Question?
I was on the National Council for Soviet Jewry in the late 70s, and certainly the Soviet Union was not sympathetic to the Jews. What caused them to give that information in 1976?
I'll repeat the question. I'm always reluctant to speak at length here because I know I'm going to get great questions and I don't want to miss out on them. The question was, since the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s was notably hostile to Jews, it was, most of you will remember, a big fight over Soviet Jewish immigration. You know, if they were unsympathetic to Jews, why would they have shared information on Demjanek's wartime past with the West? Why did they go public against him? Again, it has to be speculation. I think there are two reasons. One, the Soviet Union suffered horribly during World War II, and they had no tolerance for Nazi criminals, period, no matter who, whom they killed. And they had prosecuted and executed many of the guards from the death camps whom they captured, or they had sent them to long periods of internment in Siberia. There's probably an additional reason. You'll remember, you were part of it, as was I. Western countries, human rights groups, civil rights groups, governments were constantly shining a light on Soviet human rights violations, including in the case of Jews, violations of their religious freedom, violations of their right to travel, to leave the country, etc. And I think part of the Soviet strategy involved making the argument, and they did, that, who are you in the West to lecture us about human rights violations when you are giving safe haven to the worst human rights violators of all, Nazi war criminals. So it had value to them from a propaganda standpoint. But they also knew that if any of our defendants succeeded in their fairly common defense, at least in many of the cases that evidence that we got from the Soviet Union was forged, was perjured, that would be the end of the effort to prosecute cases involving evidence from the Soviet Union. And I'm convinced that they were very careful to avoid that possibility.
Mr. Message?
The American legal system is set up to afford every possible protection to the individual, but it is also set up so that if you have enough money and good lawyers, justice can be prevented from taking place for a long, long time. Isn't there something that can be done about that? I mean, this is an example of just what I'm saying.
I mean, it's one of the great problems in the American legal system. I'm not sure what you can do about it. Our courts are overwhelmed. They have to give priority to criminal cases, especially where people are in custody and deserve to have their status adjudicated as quickly as practicable. I wish there were a good answer to that, but I'm not aware of it.
Edith?
Were there obstacles placed in your way within our government to get you to stop this and not pursue it any further?
The question is, were there obstacles in our way, placed in our way by other parts of the government to try to get us to end this work generally, I suppose, not just the Demjanek case? No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think we had resource shortages at OSI over the years. The entire federal government did, and so we took cuts the way everybody else did. But when you're racing the clock as fast as you responsibly can to secure a measure of justice in these cases, you don't have the luxury of saying, okay, well, we're a few prosecutors short now, but in 5 years we'll have them. So it was very difficult to deal with. If you'll permit me to interrupt you with one thing, I had thought I might share with you some notes that I took. Many of you will remember that the great Yankee first baseman Lou Gehrig, who died of ALS, a terrible disease that affected my family as well much later, made a famous speech in Yankee Stadium after he was diagnosed, in which he said that actually you shouldn't feel sorry for me, he said, because I feel today like the luckiest guy on the face of the earth. It wasn't true when Lou Gehrig said it, obviously, and it's not true of John Demjanek either, but in some respects, he was very, very fortunate. For example, if the Nazis had not had time to raise Sobibor and destroy most of its records, documentation linking Demjanek to that death camp might have been found by post-war Polish authorities, and might have been shared with the West. He might have been arrested in the U.S. occupation zone right after the war, before Poland got into the Soviet orbit, and that would have resulted presumably in his having been arrested and surrendered to Poland or even the Soviet Union, where he would surely have been convicted and probably executed. If the Cold War hadn't swiftly brought post-war U.S.-Soviet cooperation to a halt, U.S. occupation authorities could have checked with the Soviets and found out that Demjanek had been a death camp guard. Then he would have been shipped to Poland again with the USSR, and again, almost certainly would have been executed, or at least sent to Siberia for decades. The Cold War saved his life. If U.S. immigration authorities had realized what the word Sobibor on his immigration papers connoted, they would have investigated and might have figured out the truth about his wartime past, which again would have doomed him to be sent to Poland or the Soviet Union. The persistence of the Cold War continued to prevent U.S.-Soviet cooperation for decades, thereby enabling Demjanek to enjoy decades of the good life in America, actually for nearly a quarter of a century, until he was at last exposed in 1976. Another example, if the original denaturalization case in Cleveland had been developed and prosecuted as a Sobibor case, instead of a Treblinka case, or aggressively prosecuted also as a Sobibor case, Demjanek still would have been adjudged deportable to the Soviet Union. But this time, well, let's say if it had been litigated as a Sobibor case, this time no Israeli extradition request would have intervened, as the Israelis wanted to prosecute a case only in which there were Jewish and preferably Israeli eyewitnesses. Then he would have been deported to the Soviet Union without the Israeli extradition request getting in the way. And there, as in the case of another death camp guard we sent to the Soviet Union, he would have been tried and almost certainly would have been executed. Another example, if in deciding the original denaturalization case, Chief Judge Frank Battisti hadn't declined to reach the issue of Sobibor service, and had instead found that Demjanek served at Sobibor in addition to Treblinka, the Israelis probably would have charged him with service at both camps. Had they done so years later, when the Israeli Treblinka conviction unraveled, the case would still have stood as the Sobibor part of the conviction would still have rested on solid grounds. There would have been no reasonable basis to overturn it, and Demjanek likely would have been executed in Israel. If the Israeli Supreme Court, after the case unraveled, had permitted retrial of the case as a Sobibor case, he undoubtedly would have been convicted and probably would have been executed in Israel. And finally, if the collapse of Soviet communism had occurred just a few years later than it did, the evidence that cast doubt on the Treblinka Ivan the Terrible part of the case would have emerged from Soviet archives too late to help Demjanek, as his Israeli death sentence would have already been carried out. So just as the Cold War saved his life, it ended just in time to save it again.
I think we should ask questions of Eli privately.
Please do.
Thank
you so much.
Mark could have gone to the stores downtown and bought the starting materials for those acetone peroxides that were used by those terrorists.